Otherwise, I'm going to assume that we're all ready, and I will get started. The right of self-defense never ceases. It is among the most sacred and alike necessary to nations and to individuals. It is because I agree with James Monroe that a government has a moral obligation to defend its nation and citizens that I stand resolved in favor of today's resolution, that preventive war is ethical. To clarify today's debate, I'd like to bring up a few definitions. Preventive war is defined by the Department of Defense as a war initiated in the belief that military conflict, while not imminent, is inevitable, and that to delay would involve greater risk. Ethical is defined as morally good or correct, and self-defense is defined as the right to prevent suffering force or violence through the use of a sufficient level of counteracting force or violence. Before I move deeper into my case, I'd like to bring up a point of resolutional analysis, that of preventive war defined. Again, resolutional analysis, preventive war defined. Certain types of warfare can only be called preventive if it has all of the following qualities. The first of which is that of an inevitable conflict. In order for preventive war to be true preventive war, there needs to be an inevitable conflict, an attack that is coming beyond a reasonable shadow of a doubt. Nothing else will stop the attack. However, the second quality is that of a last resort. Preventive war should only be used as a last resort when all other options have failed. When we are about to be attacked, we need to take the best actions of defending ourselves. Waiting until the attack lands will be too late. My value for today's debate is that of life. Thomas Jefferson once said the chief purpose of government is to protect life. Abandon that and you have abandoned all. When lives are lost, the government has failed in its duty. Today, I will be bringing up two contentions or main points that show us why preventive war is ethical. The first of which is that preventive war protects life. Again, contention one, preventive war protects life. Now, this may not sound right at first. How can warfare protect lives? When preventive war is used, it protects lives by nipping the attack in the bud. An enemy's forces are neutralized before they are fully ready to do any damage. If we look back to the definition of preventive war, it only occurs when inaction would lead to greater risk. This means to sit back and to do nothing will lead to the loss of life. Let's take a look at how this works through an application and an analogy. The application you can write down as World War II. Again, application, World War II. World War II is actually an example of where preventive war could have been used, but was not. War with the Axis was inevitable. Every concession and diplomatic endeavor was used, and yet the Allies did nothing. If the French and British had used preventive war on Germany while their forces were still unprepared, the war would have been a lot shorter. Dunkirk, the Battle for Britain, D-Day, and many other bloody battles wouldn't have happened. Instead, the French focused their resources on a line of forts that were completely bypassed by the Nazis. My analogy is that of the school shooter. Again, analogy, the school shooter. Let's say, for example, that you're a policeman. You receive credible evidence that a certain person is going to attack a school in your area. If you do nothing, the students will inevitably be hurt. In this situation, the obvious course of action is to take preventive action to ensure that the shooter cannot take the lives of the students. If the policeman had to wait for shots to be fired, it would already have been too late, and lives would have been lost. Preventive warfare actually saves lives. To wait until an attack lands is only inviting disaster. My second contention is that of the best defense. Again, contention two, the best defense. A government has a moral obligation to protect its citizens. One of the best ways of doing this is using preventive war when an attack is inevitable. Subpoint A is that self-defense is ethical. If you were walking through a dark alley with your family and saw another person walk towards you and pull out a knife and start threatening you and your family, it would be ethical for you to strike him first to protect your life and the lives of those dependent on you. Subpoint B is that preventive war is self-defense. Again, subpoint B, preventive war is self-defense. Preventive war is another form of self-defense. If you knew that someone was about to hurt you, striking first before it would be too late would be in self-defense. Looking back to my definition of self-defense, preventive war prevents suffering force by using counteracting force to stop it. So it does fall under the category of self-defense. Let me show you this through my application of Operation Catapult. Again, application, Operation Catapult. Operation Catapult was carried out by the British Navy against the French in 1940. After Dunkirk, France made it clear that she was going to surrender to Germany. Part of the treaty stipulated that France would have to relinquish the fourth largest navy in the world over to the Nazis. After numerous diplomatic attempts and warnings to sail the French fleet to safety in British harbors to no effect, Britain decided to preventively strike the French navy to ensure that they would not fall into German hands. They succeeded and disabled the French fleet. Because of their victory, Germany did not get control over these ships. If they had, however, it would have been enough to tip the naval superiority of Britain over to the Nazis. Because naval superiority was the only thing stopping German soldiers from crossing the Channel and invading England, Operation Catapult possibly saved the Allies from losing the war. Subpoint C is that of duty of government. Again, subpoint C, duty of government. The duty of government is to protect their citizens. When countries use preventive war as their best defense against inevitable attacks, they are fulfilling their government's duty to its people. Governments have a moral obligation to protect their citizens, and the best way of doing that is by using preventive war. That is why preventive war is ethical. I am now open for any questions that the NEG may have for me.
All right, 3 minutes on the clock if you're ready to go.
Yes.
All right. Can we agree that it's ethical to protect all lives?
Sure.
All right. Can we agree that with the instance of World War II, war was incredibly close at hand by the time diplomacy was finished?
Actually, I don't believe so.
Okay, can you tell me what year it was when diplomacy was finished?
There's not exactly a year when diplomacy actually finished in World War II, but what we see, sure.
Well, what year did we launch the preventive war?
We did not launch a preventive war in World War II, but we should have.
Okay, when should have France launched a preventive war? What year?
Again, there's not a specific year for that, but once they saw that Germany was not going to give up, once they saw that Germany was not going to be stopped, that's when they should have used preventive war.
All right. You brought up this idea of how self-defense is ethical. Let me give you a scenario. If I knew with 100% certainty that one person was going to kill me in 20 minutes, and so that person was in this room, and the only way to save myself and stop me from being killed was to kill 50 other people with them, would that still be ethical?
It would depend on whether or not those 50 other people are innocent.
The 50 other people are innocent, and it's the only way to defend myself.
I don't believe that is ethical.
Okay, so then can we agree that there's instances in which actions of self-defense aren't ethical?
In a sense, what your analogy is painting is not necessarily a scenario of self-defense, because you aren't actually defending yourself against an enemy. Rather, you're killing other people to protect your own life.
Can we agree that I would be stopping an enemy who would invariably kill me?
No. Okay, so what your scenario is painting is a scenario when you're protecting your own life by taking other people's lives. What self-defense means is that you're stopping force or violence that's going to happen to you by using counteracting force.
And can we agree that definitionally self-defense is the defense of one's self?
Sorry, what?
Can we agree that definitionally self-defense is the defense of oneself?
Sure.
Great. Now moving into your idea of preventive war defined, can we agree that the definition states it's non-imminent?
Yes.
Is ethicality universal?
Explain that statement.
Is ethicality a concept that applies to all nations and all people equally?
Yes.
Do all nations have a right to defend their citizens?
Yes.
And you're claiming preventive war defends citizens, correct?
Of course.
Does that mean all nations can use preventive war?
Yes.
Does North Korea have a right to protect their citizens?
Yes.
And does North Korea believe war with the United States to be inevitable?
No.
Interesting. I'll bring up a quote on that in my next speech. No further questions. 3 minutes of preparation time will begin now. No further preparation time necessary. 1 minute and 50 seconds remaining. Seven minutes on the clock. If one of y'all can confirm that everyone can hear me okay?
Yes.
I confirm.
Great. Dwight D. Eisenhower won World War II and is widely regarded as one of the greatest American generals of all time. He once weighed on our resolution saying, quote, "The United States and its allies must reject the concept of preventive war," end quote. And, quote, "I would never listen to anyone seriously that came and talked about such a thing," end quote. I'm going to stand with the world's greatest military expert and American hero, and I think you should too. For that reason, I am resolved that preventive war is not ethical. Now, before I jump into the points of contention, I want to point out the common grounds my opponent and I share. I can accept all three definitions presented by the affirmative, as well as the value of life. But I want to propose one additional definition, and it's that of imminent, which Merriam-Webster defines as simply, quote, "ready to take place or happening soon," end quote. And I'd also like to propose one point of resolution analysis. You can write it down as distant threats. Distant threats. My opponent would love it if you'd believe that preventive war occurs when we know a threat's coming and it's a life or death scenario. But the definition specifically says otherwise. It says the threat is non-imminent, or it's not happening soon. If the threat's far away, we have other options and time to try them. With preventive war, we're not removing threats that are at hand. Instead, we're aiming the gun at the target and pulling the trigger about 7 years before it comes into focus. We'll deal with why that's an issue in just a second. But first, I want to address their resolutional analysis. They brought up this idea of how it's inevitable and it's the last resort. My response is impossible to attain. Impossible to attain. While this sounds delightful in concept, there's some severe logical issues. For starters, it's only the belief of inevitability. And when they talk about the last resort, that's also impossible because these threats aren't close at hand. They're specifically stated as not ready to take place or not happening soon. These two criterions can't logically stand underneath the definition presented by the affirmative. Now, I'd like to present two contentions of my own as to how preventive war needlessly destroys our value of life before I respond to my opponents. Write my first contention down as bombing the future. Bombing the future. Preventive war is only attractive when you think about it as stopping a future attack based on amazing intelligence. But by definition, preventive war attacks threats that are years away from being harmful, meaning that voting affirmative says we pull the trigger 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years in advance. We'll see why that's a problem in my first application. Iraq War 2003. Working in government's difficult. You're asked to make hard decisions based off of incomplete information. Just look at the illustration of the United States and Iraq. All of our governmental officials, Hillary Clinton, Donald Rumsfeld, President Bush himself, were convinced that war with our enemies was inevitable, based off our certainty that Iraq had nuclear missiles. Based off our perceptions of the future, we launched a preventive war. President Bush later came out and said our intelligence was wrong. The weapons didn't exist. We called it a mistake. But the truth is, it's a mistake that destroyed the lives of 4,487 American men and women and 100,000 innocent Iraqi citizens for no reason at all. Government's intentions are much like my opponent's, good but overly excitable. After all, governments are made up out of humans, and when addressing threats that by definition aren't happening soon, we need to take that into account. Preventive war wants us to take action years before the threat is actually a viable potential harm. We're simply not capable of adequately attacking as far in the future as preventive war demands. It'll start pointless conflicts, and those pointless conflicts will destroy life. But there's another major problem with preventive war. And you can write down my second contention as sparks international conflict. Sparks international conflict. I get it. Preventive war sounds decently acceptable when we think in the framework my opponent presented, namely good governments having this tool and using it like superheroes to stop all the bad guys. But that's not how it works. As my opponent conceded in cross-examination, ethicality is a universal concept, meaning voting affirmative says preventive war, as a general moral rule, is ethical for any nation. Here's why that's dangerous. Application number 2, international relations. International relations. Now, according to Business Insider, in their October 25th of 2017 article, North Korea has an EMP weapon to wipe out basically the entirety of our electric grid, and nuclear missiles to destroy our major cities such as Los Angeles, Denver, Chicago, Boston, and New York. And in 2017, a North Korean governmental official said that nuclear war in the Korean peninsula, cough, cough, with the United States, is inevitable. North Korea isn't alone. Our globe is full of nations who want to blow each other up. According to Aaron Heller, IJAC in the transcript, Pakistan and India, Israel and Iran, and Israel and Gaza have all recently stated they believe war with each other to be inevitable. The question before us today is if we want the world to erupt into a fireball of chaos, missile strikes, and casualties. If you think I'm being drastic, that's because preventive war is a drastic action. There's a reason it's illegal under international law, and decorated war hero Dwight D. Eisenhower condemned it. Let's deal with some of my opponent's contentions. First, he brought up this contention of how preventive war protects life, and my response is that of needlessly destroys. I couldn't disagree more. Preventive war as a concept tries to take out threats before they actually exist. It attacks years before they come to fruition and attacks threats that are nowhere near being ready. That's just pointless conflict and does the inverse of what my opponent said. They had two applications, World War II and an analogy of the school shooter. My response is that of imminent. Now, France dealt with the issue of World War II with diplomacy right up until the time that the conflict actually happened. They haven't been able to present the year we should have used preventive war. They haven't proven to you that the threat was still non-imminent, we would have attacked. The truth of it is we should have attacked, but not using preventive war, because at that point it would have been a preemptive strike, which is outside of the resolution. His next intention was out of the best defense, and he basically said self-defense is ethical and preventive war is self-defense. My response is that of self-defense doesn't justify. Self-defense doesn't justify. Now, as we covered in cross-examination, if I killed 50 people to stop one who would invariably kill me, that wouldn't be okay. Now, it would be self-defense, but it would still be unethical. The problem with self-defense is it's a concept that can be used ethically, but just because something's being used as self-defense doesn't inherently make it ethical. And I brought up the application of Operation Catapult, and my response is that of current conflict. In this situation, they were already involved with war with Germany. This wouldn't have been a preventive war. It was just a continuation of current battles. I don't want you to vote for an action, but I do want you to vote against this concept of knee-jerk reactions and instead use calculated and controlled military force. Thanks.
All right, this is a 3-minute cross-examination, so if you're ready. All right, then let's get started. So you agreed with my definition of preventive war, correct?
Yes.
You would also agree that in that definition, it says that to delay would involve greater risk, correct?
We believe that to delay would involve greater risk.
Sure. Okay. Can you give me an example of something that's inevitable?
Dying.
Dying? Okay. Why do you believe that that's inevitable?
Because we have solid evidence and we see it happen all the time.
Oh, sure. So you would agree that inevitable is a strong word, correct?
No, I say that it's a word that is thrown around a lot and can be strong or it can be weak.
Oh, sure, but okay, could you give me a definition of what inevitable means?
The definition is basically saying that they think the war is impossible to avoid.
No. I don't want a definition of belief of inevitability. I want a definition of what inevitable really means.
Inevitable means that you don't think you can avoid it.
Okay. Interesting. Let's move on. Talking about your application of international relations. You would agree that the evidence you read came from 2017, correct?
Yes, but it's still consistent with what's going on in the world today.
But you would agree that in recent years, we've been having peace talks with North Korea, correct?
They're currently offering us a Christmas present of nuclear war. I don't really think that that's been discontinued yet.
All right, so it's your contention that there have been no peace talks.
There have been peace talks. I'm just contending they haven't been incredibly effective.
All right, sure. Let's talk about the application. Actually, let's move on. Do you believe in God?
Yes.
And why is that?
That is a personal belief based off personal information.
All right. But would it be fair to say that one aspect of that belief is based on evidence?
Yes.
All right, sure. Does the government have a moral obligation to protect its citizens?
They have an ethical obligation to protect all life.
All right, sure. So do they have an ethical obligation to protect guilty life above innocent life?
I mean, are these people actually guilty who you want to needlessly slaughter?
Sure, but if that were the case.
I mean, if you can prove that someone who hasn't done anything yet is actually guilty of a crime worthy of dying, then I suppose we could find an ethical solution where it might possibly be okay to kill them.
Sure. So let's say that you're the leader of the United States. You receive credible evidence that someone is going to bomb New York. Do you think it would be ethical for you to try to stop him first, even though he has not done anything?
What does the time frame look like?
Let's say maybe a year, but this is your only chance to stop him.
I mean, if I've got a year, it's not my only chance to
Sure,
stop
but
him.
what if
so I
it
would
was
wait
your
a bit.
only chance?
Well, there's no way for it to be my only chance, as I'd have 365 days to act.
Oh, sure, but what if let's just say, for example, that it was your only chance.
There's no way it could be my only chance.
All right, no further questions. Starting affirmative prep time? Starting now. All right, stopping affirmative prep time. I have 2 minutes remaining. This is a 4-minute speech. So I'm going to go ahead and assume, unless I hear otherwise, I'm going to assume that we're all ready, and I'll get started. Murder begins where self-defense ends. George Buckner recognized that to sit idly by while an inevitable attack is coming is nothing short of murder. A government has a right to use preventive war to ensure that life is protected. Let's take a look at some responses. In response to the argument talking about how it's impossible to attain, my opponent's argument against my resolutional analysis about how it's impossible to obtain, my response is that of incontrovertible evidence. Again, incontrovertible evidence. Now, he talked about how it's impossible to obtain, first of all, because it's based on the belief. However, like we talked about in cross-examination, in order for someone to truly believe that something is inevitable, that something is going to happen no matter what, you have to have strong evidence of such. Just as we all believe that it's inevitable that someday we will die. But you have to have strong evidence in order to call that inevitable. In the same way, in order for a government to believe that something is inevitable, that war is inevitable, they must have incontrovertible evidence of such. In response to your contention one, that of bombing the future, my response is that waiting is too late. Again, waiting is too late. As we agreed, my opponent agreed with my definition of preventive war. And as we agreed in cross-examination, that definition stipulates that to delay would involve greater risk. What this means is that if we do nothing now, when there is an inevitable attack based on incontrovertible evidence, we are simply murdering the lives of our citizens. In response to the Iraq War of 2003, my response is that of inevitable conflict prevented. Again, inevitable conflict prevented. According to the Washington Examiner, quote, the sanctions regime was actively collapsing thanks to countries like Jordan, France, Germany, and Russia. Had it collapsed entirely, Saddam Hussein could have rebuilt his weapons programs. Later in the article, it said this, quote, all documents seized the aftermath of his fall, however, show that the Iraqi dictator planned to restart his program as soon as sanctions collapsed. The war prevented an Iraq armed with a nuclear, biological, or chemical arsenal, period, end quote. What we see here is that we had evidence of an inevitable conflict. And to delay until Iraq actually had these weapons in their arsenal would have meant the death of millions of American citizens. In response to the application of international relations, I have 2 responses. The first response is that of outdated. Again, outdated. What we see is that this evidence is from 2017. We've been having numerous peace talks since then. However, my second response is that of last resort. Again, last resort. Now, again, it's important to realize that there's 2 criteria that have to be met in order for someone to engage in preventive war. The first of which is that there must be an inevitable conflict. So people can't just go around, other people can't just go around and attack the United States just because they want to. Rather, they have to truly believe that a conflict is inevitable. However, they also have to believe that that this is the last resort. However, when we take a look at international relations, we quite simply see that when other people attack us in the name of preventive war, that isn't actually preventive war because these 2 criteria aren't actually met. In response to the argument talking about how World War II and the school shooter are imminent, my response is that of not imminent, but inevitable. Again, not imminent, but inevitable. What we see in the case of World War II is that this was not actually imminent. What we saw is that Germany showed aggression years before they attacked. And I don't think any of us would believe that that qualifies as imminent. And yet we used every form of diplomatic transactions possible, and yet we did nothing. The cost of that was that delaying involved defeat. We lost millions of lives in a war that should have been prevented. He talked about how self-defense doesn't justify. My response is that of already guilty. Again, already guilty. What we see is that in preventive war, the person who is going to attack you is already guilty, so it is justified. His response to the application of Operation Catapult was that of current conflict. My response is that of not with France. In this situation, Britain was not at war with France, and these were French ships. Thanks.
All right, I've got 1 minute and 50 seconds of preparation remaining, and I'll start that now. All right, now for the preparation time, 6 minutes on the clock. Y'all are good to go. Alrighty. 105,000 people dead and no weapons found. I personally find it terrifying that my opponent can somehow ethically justify the killing of thousands of innocents for no apparent reason. And so before we jump into some direct refutation, I want to point out two main burdens of a negative ballot. The two things I need to prove to you in order to win today's round. The first thing I have to prove is that until you actually take an action, you are innocent. The second thing I need to prove is that preventive war needlessly destroys lives by acting before the threats happen. We'll be jumping to those in my voting issues after some quick direct refutation. For starters, he brought up this point about incontrovertible evidence, and I'm going to have a couple responses. First, that of non-eminent. Non-eminent. There's no way this evidence can be incontrovertible. That isn't definitionally correct. It simply says that we believe, or we have the feeling of being certain that the threat's going to come. But because these threats are so far in the future, a point my opponent completely dropped, there is no way that this evidence can truly be incontrovertible. Remember, we're 7 years out here. There's no way our evidence is 100% accurate. My second response is that of belief. Belief. Now, even if somehow we can see 7 years in the future, it's still just based on our beliefs of what's going to happen. It's not incontrovertible evidence. If it's incontrovertible evidence, it falls underneath the definition of a preemptive attack. Underneath a preventive war, we simply believe that it can't be avoided. And that's quite possibly wrong. Now, next, he brought up this idea about how waiting is too late. My response is that of threats non-imminent. Threats non-imminent. Once again, he never responded to my point of resolutional analysis. Waiting isn't too late if these threats are years away from being ready to take place. If the threat's not ready to take place, leaving it there can't hurt us. He brought this idea about basically inevitable conflict prevented with Iraq. My response is that of pointless casualties. Pointless casualties. And he read this evidence about how we think that Hussein would have probably started another program that could have possibly done this. So our predictions. But at the end of the day, 100,000 people are dead and the country's in shambles. So regardless of what would have happened, people died for no reason. There was no reason to attack. He brought this idea about how my North Korea evidence is outdated, and I've got two responses. First, Christmas surprise. Christmas surprise. Now, if you've done much news reading lately, you know Kim Jong-un at the very beginning of this year has been threatening us with Christmas nukes and Christmas surprises in order to give us, I suppose, not joy? So this isn't really outdated, since these threats and talks are still continuing to this very day. And secondly, other has 2019. Other from 2019. Now, the second part of that evidence I read, the second few articles, all came from 2019, and these were completely dropped by my opponent, those three other countries who would immediately attack upon an affirmative ballot. He brought this idea about how World War II was not imminent but inevitable. My response is that of after last resort. After last resort. We could not have acted until after the diplomacy, per points of resolution analysis he thinks we have to uphold to, and beyond that, by the time the diplomacy was over, it was way too late to take any action. Finally, he talked about this idea about how already guilty. My response is that of hasn't acted. Hasn't acted. This goes against every ethical principle we know. The idea someone's already guilty for doing nothing. Finally, he talked about the idea of within the current conflict, how it's not within. My response is that of contradiction. Regarding this Operation Catapult, he said when he first read it that they were already in acts of war. He's contradicted himself, and this point is irrelevant. I'd also like to point out he dropped my response to his first contention about preventive war needlessly destroying lives. I have two main voting issues for you. Write the first one down as innocent until acted. Innocent until action. This stance is very simple. It's simply the idea that until someone actually acts against someone else, they're innocent. They haven't forfeited their right to life, and they haven't done anything wrong until they actually harm someone. We can claim that they're planning to do something, but they are innocent until they're proven guilty. And they can't be proven guilty until they've actually taken an action. My second voting issue is that of preventive war destroys. Preventive war destroys. Now, specifically referencing back to some of my main points about how preventive war destroys life, I'm going to have a couple subpoints. First, that of future threats. Future threats. When addressing this, we have to remember the unrefuted point: these threats are far in the future. We don't know exactly how far away. We just know that they're A, not ready, and B, not happening soon. We're not attacking threats that are at hand, and if we fail to act, there will be no problems. Maybe in 8 years we'll have to take action, but we can still use things such as preemptive strikes. My second subpoint is that of international fire. International fire. I've been talking about this since the very beginning of our debate round, but if we vote affirmative, we're ethically justifying North Korea attacking the United States and multiple other countries attacking each other for threats that quite possibly could have been avoided, needlessly damaging thousands of lives. This logic was never refuted. And my final subpoint is that of pointless casualties. Pointless casualties. Now, I'm not a pacifist. I think there is perfectly acceptable times when we can act underneath acts of war, once there's an actual problem to address. But that's not what preventive war does. It attacks threats that aren't ready. It attacks threats that aren't happening soon. It attacks threats that quite possibly would never happen. I don't want you to vote negative because I'm against protecting people. I don't want you to vote negative because I'm against war. I want you to vote negative because I don't want thousands of pointless wars destroying lives for no apparent reason. If either of those two voting issues is still standing when the affirmative is done talking, I believe a negative ballot has been warranted. Thank you.
All right, starting the remainder of affirmative prep time, 2 minutes, starting now. All right, no further prep time remaining. This is a 3-minute affirmative rebuttal. So again, I'm going to go ahead and assume that we're all ready unless I hear otherwise. And I will get started. In February 2018, Florida was hit by a major school shooting that took 17 lives. Prior to the shooting, the sheriff's department received 18 calls about the shooter. The police and the FBI could have taken preventive action, but did nothing. That analogy that I gave in my first speech is not just an analogy. It's something that happens every day in the real world. Preventive war protects innocent lives by allowing nations to defend themselves. Rejecting prevention means inaction when active defense is needed most. And that is why I continue to stand resolved that preventive war is ethical. In response to the two arguments talking about how non-imminent and belief, talking about the resolution analysis, my response is that of impossible to believe without evidence. Again, impossible to believe without evidence. Again, a point that I stated in my last speech that really never went addressed is that in order to believe that something is truly inevitable, you must have incontrovertible evidence of such. In the last speech, my opponent said that sometimes a regular war is ethical when you're fighting in self-defense. But what we have to understand here is that even in a regular war, we are still operating on the belief that we're fighting an enemy. So if that's justified, when we take a look at preventive war, when we have incontrovertible evidence and a belief of inevitability based on such, to it not act would mean disaster. In response to the argument talking about how threats are non-imminent, my response is that of by definition. Again, by definition. It's interesting that my opponent agreed to my definition of preventive war and yet has pushed aside my definition throughout the entirety of today's debate. What we see is that waiting is too late by definition. To delay would involve greater risk. In response to the argument talking about the Iraq war, my response is that of millions of lives saved. Again, millions of lives saved. What we see from the evidence is that if we had not invaded Iraq, Iraq would now be capable of nuclear weapons and would be aiming them at the United States. In response to the argument talking about how after last resort, talking about World War II, my response is that of diplomacy proven useless. Again, diplomacy proven useless. What we see is that diplomacy was proven useless years before Germany actually attacked France and Britain. What we see here is not an imminent conflict, but rather an inevitable conflict. In response to the argument talking about how they aren't guilty if they haven't acted, my response is that of intent to harm. Again, intent to harm. What we see is that they are already guilty because they are intending to harm us. When that happens, the only course of action is to defend ourselves. My one and only voting issue is that of the cost of inaction. Again, voting issue, the cost of inaction. When we are faced with an attack that is already coming and do nothing, the consequences are devastating. The cost of inaction during the World War II was that millions of lives were lost in a war that could have been prevented. The cost of inaction in the school shooter analogy is that the students will be shot. How many more lives are we willing to lose before we do the right thing? After World War II, when the world was engulfed in a war that lasted 6 years, we said, never again. Perhaps it's time we truly made it. Thanks. Great round, Luke, and